Tonight, we journey to a time when iron became faith, and faith became armor, when young men knelt through darkness before altars where their swords lay waiting, when castles rose from hilltops like stone prayers against an uncertain sky. We descend into the world of medieval knights, those warriors wrapped in metal and mystery, who lived by codes that were never fully written, yet governed everything, who rode through centuries that still echo in our imagination. The medieval knight was not merely soldier, but was symbol made flesh, was duty given human form, was the dream of honor that an entire age tried to embody. For nearly 500 years, from the chaos following Rome's fall through the transformations of the Renaissance, these armored warriors shaped the history of Europe, fighting its wars, defending its borders, serving its kings, and creating a culture of honor and obligation that still influences how we think about courage, duty, and what it means to serve something greater than oneself. Tonight we explore their world, the cold vigils before dawn, the weight of armor that became second skin, the castles that sheltered generations, the tournaments where glory and death danced together. We will walk through stone corridors where torchlight flickered against walls that had witnessed centuries. We will stand in the silence of chapels where oaths were sworn that could not be unsworn. We will feel the weight of swords that carried names that were blessed by priests, that were buried with their owners as if the steel itself possessed soul. The knights we will meet were human, flawed, contradictory, capable of both heroism and cruelty, but they aspired to something beyond themselves, lived within frameworks of duty and honor that gave their lives meaning beyond mere survival. They were not the perfect figures of legend, but neither were they the brutal thugs that cynical retellings sometimes suggest. They were men of their age, shaped by its beliefs, bound by its expectations, trying to navigate a world where violence was constant and honor was the only currency that death could not devalue. We will move through 12 chapters, each exploring a different aspect of knightly life and culture. Some chapters will take us into the physical world of the knights, their castles, their armor, their weapons, their training. Others will explore the invisible architecture of belief and obligation that shaped their behavior, the codes they followed, the faith they professed, the dreams of honor that motivated them. All will contribute to understanding how an entire civilization organized itself around the figure of the mounted warrior, how the knight became central to medieval identity in ways that extended far beyond the battlefield. The pace will be gentle. The details will accumulate slowly. We are not rushing toward conclusion, but are settling into a world, allowing its textures and rhythms to surround us, letting the past become present enough to feel real before it fades back into memory. The medieval world was slower than ours, measured its time differently, valued patience and persistence over speed and disruption. To understand the knights, we must first slow down enough to enter their world on its own terms. So settle in. Adjust your pillow one final time. Let the weight of the day release. And prepare to journey to a time when stone walls rose against uncertain horizons, when the clash of steel decided kingdoms, when honor was armor more valuable than iron, when the night rode through history, trailing legends that have never entirely faded. The evening deepens. The castle gates stand open in memory, and we begin. In the hours before dawn, when cathedral stones held the cold of centuries and candlelight trembled against vaulted darkness, a young man knelt alone before an altar where his sword lay waiting. Not yet his, not yet blessed, still belonging to the silence that would shape him before the morning came. We begin in this sacred space between boyhood and oath, in the night-long prayer that transformed flesh into vow, where every choice to remain kneeling was a choice to become something that could not be undone. The vigil was the final threshold, the last night before knighthood, and it was meant to be difficult. The young man, squire until morning, knight by noon if he endured, had been bathed earlier, the ritual washing symbolizing purification, the water carrying away not just dirt, but the person he had been, preparing him to become the person he would be. He had been dressed in white, the color of innocence and beginning, and led to the chapel as evening deepened, as the household prepared for a night of celebration, while he prepared for a night of solitary prayer. The chapel doors closed behind him, and he was alone with his weapons, his conscience, and his God. The sword lay on the altar, the shield beside it, the spurs that would mark him as knight waiting to be buckled onto his heels by hands more worthy than his own. These objects were not merely equipment, but were symbols, each carrying meaning that the long night would deepen. The sword was justice, was the power to protect and to punish, was the terrible responsibility of deciding who lived and who died. The shield was defense, was the obligation to stand between danger and those who could not defend themselves. The spurs were the mark of the mounted warrior, the cavalry that dominated medieval battle, the horse and rider unity that made the knight supreme on fields where infantry could only scatter and flee. He knelt, and the hours began their slow passage. The vigil was not test of physical endurance alone, though physical endurance was certainly tested. The stone floor was cold, the posture demanding, the prohibition against food and drink and sleep, creating discomfort that grew with each passing hour. But the true test was internal, was the requirement to examine conscience, to consider the vows about to be taken, to ask whether the soul was ready for the burden the body would soon carry. The darkness of the chapel was meant to mirror the darkness within, to create space for honest confrontation with one's own weaknesses and doubts. What did he think about, that young man kneeling through the hours when the world slept? We cannot know specifically, but we can imagine the themes that would have occupied any thoughtful mind facing such a transition. He would have thought about death, certainly, for the knight's profession was violence, and violence could receive as well as give. He might die in battle, might be captured and ransomed, might be wounded in ways that ended his career even if they spared his life. The oath he was about to swear committed him to dangers that could not be predicted or avoided, risks that were not occasional but constant. He would have thought about the obligations he was accepting, the duties that came with the honor. The knight was sworn to protect the weak, to defend the church, to serve his lord faithfully, to maintain honor even when honor was costly. These were not abstract principles, but were practical demands that would shape daily life, that would require sacrifices he could not yet fully imagine. Was he ready to give his life for his Lord's cause? Was he ready to show mercy when vengeance beckoned? Was he ready to speak truth even when lies would be easier? The candles burned lower, their light diminishing as the night deepened. The shadows in the chapel seemed to grow, to press closer, to create the sense of being observed by presences that could not be seen but could certainly be felt. The medieval mind did not doubt that the spiritual world was real, that angels and demons watched human affairs, that every choice carried weight in cosmic scales. The young man, kneeling before the altar, understood that his vigil was witnessed, that his prayers were heard, that the oath he would swear in the morning would bind him not just before men, but before God. The hours passed like slow water, each moment stretching, the normal sense of time's passage, suspended by darkness and solitude, and the strange state between waking and sleeping that prolonged prayer induced. He was not supposed to sleep, but drowsiness came nevertheless. Waves of exhaustion that threatened to pull him under, that required constant effort to resist. This too was part of the test, the demonstration that will could overcome body, that duty could conquer comfort, that the spirit could command what the flesh would rather abandon. Near dawn, the cold became most intense. The stone had absorbed no warmth throughout the night, and the body's reserves were depleted, and the chill seemed to penetrate to the bones. The young man shivered as he prayed, his white garments offering no protection, his knees aching against the unforgiving floor, his eyes struggling to stay open against exhaustion's insistence. But he remained, because remaining was the point, because the knight he would become was being forged in this discomfort, because the oath would mean nothing if it were easy. The first grey light touched the chapel windows, the stained glass that had been dark throughout the night beginning to glow as if awakening, colours emerging slowly from what had seemed mere shadow. The dawn came gradually, light increasing by imperceptible degrees, the darkness retreating without any clear moment of surrender. And with the light came sound, movement outside the chapel, voices beginning to stir, the household awakening to the day of ceremony that awaited. But the vigil was not yet over. He remained kneeling as the light grew stronger, as the stained glass revealed its full glory, as the altar where his weapons lay became visible in colour rather than candlelight's gold. The priest would come soon, would celebrate Mass, would begin the ceremonies that would transform him. But until they came, he waited, completing what he had begun, honouring the darkness by not abandoning it until he was called. The chapel door opened. Voices entered with the light. The vigil was over, and the transformation about to be completed. We leave him there, at the threshold between one life and another, understanding that this night of solitude and prayer was not mere tradition, but was the foundation on which knighthood rested. The knight who had not examined his conscience, who had not confronted his weaknesses, who had not asked whether he was truly ready for the burden, Such a night was dangerous, was sword without wisdom, was power without reflection. The vigil ensured that every night, at least once, faced himself in darkness and chose to emerge into light with eyes open and soul examined. The chapter fades as the morning ceremonies begin. As the young man rises stiffly from the knees that have not bent for hours, as he prepares to receive the sword that has waited beside him through the night. What follows will be public, will be witnessed, will be recorded. But the vigil was private, was between the man and his God, was the secret foundation that the public ceremony merely confirmed. In the darkness before dawn, in the cold of ancient stone, in the silence that held only prayer, this was where nights were truly made. Rising from hilltops across the medieval landscape, the castles stood as mountains made by human hands. Fortresses where stone was stacked so thick that seasons seemed unable to penetrate. Where families lived generations within walls, designed first for survival and only later for comfort. We enter these ancient structures, not through the great gates where armies would clash, but through the small doors where daily life unfolded. Understanding that castles were homes before they were symbols, shelters before they were statements of power. The castle began as necessity rather than aspiration. In the centuries following Rome's fall, when central authority collapsed and local lords were left to defend their own territories, the fortified dwelling became essential to survival. The earliest castles were simple. Mounds of earth topped with wooden palisades, strongholds that could be constructed quickly and defended by small numbers of men against the raiders and rivals who threatened constantly. These motte and bailey castles dotted the landscape of early medieval Europe. Humble structures that nevertheless represented the fundamental principle that would guide castle development for centuries. Height and enclosure meant safety. But wood burns and earth erodes, and as resources allowed, the lords began building in stone. The transformation was gradual, spanning generations, each improvement building on what came before. The wooden palisade became a stone wall. The wooden tower became a stone keep. The simple enclosure became a complex of walls within walls, each layer of defense requiring attackers to breach more obstacles before reaching the heart of the fortress. By the high medieval period, the castle had become the sophisticated structure we imagine when we hear the word. Massive curtain walls punctuated by towers, great keeps rising at the center, elaborate gatehouses designed to trap and destroy anyone who forced entry. We enter such a castle now, approaching across the landscape that it dominates. The site was chosen carefully, usually a hilltop that commanded views of surrounding territory, sometimes a river crossing that controlled movement and trade. The approach was designed to be difficult, the path winding upward through slopes that tired attackers while exposing them to arrows from the walls above. The walls themselves were thick, 10 feet, sometimes 15, sometimes more, made of local stone fitted carefully by masons who understood that survival depended on their craft. The gatehouse was the most vulnerable point, and therefore the most heavily defended. The great gates were made of oak reinforced with iron, capable of resisting battering rams for hours, while defenders rained death from above. Behind the gates, the passage turned, forcing attackers to navigate corners while remaining under fire. Murder holes opened in the ceiling, allowing defenders to pour boiling liquid or drop stones on anyone who penetrated this far. Arrow slits lined the walls, narrow openings that protected archers while allowing them to shoot into the confined space. Beyond the gatehouse lay the bailey, the courtyard that was the castle's functional centre. Here stood the buildings that supported daily life: kitchens and bakeries, stables and smithies, storerooms and workshops. The bailey was city in miniature, containing everything necessary for the castle community to survive. Arranged efficiently within walls that enclosed precious space. Servants moved through this space constantly, carrying water from the well, tending fires in the forges, preparing food for the household that could number in the hundreds. The great keep rose above all else, the castle's final refuge, the tower that would be held even if all other defences fell. The keep's walls were thickest of all, sometimes 20 feet of solid stone. Its entrance often above ground level, accessible only by stairs that could be destroyed to trap attackers below. Within the keep were the lord's private chambers, the treasury, the stores that would sustain the defenders through siege. The keep was designed to be held indefinitely, its occupants waiting behind walls that siege engines would struggle to breach, waiting for relief that would eventually come, or for attackers to exhaust their resources and withdraw. But the castle was not merely fortress, it was home. And within its walls life unfolded through the seasons, in patterns that the military purpose both constrained and protected. The great hall was the castle's heart, the room where the community gathered, where meals were taken, where justice was administered, where celebrations marked the turning of the year. The hall was dominated by the hearth, the fire that burned continuously through winter months, its smoke rising to the rafters before finding exit through vents in the roof. The lord's table stood on a raised platform at one end, visible to all, the physical representation of hierarchy that shaped every aspect of medieval life. The lord's private chambers offered what privacy the age allowed. Rooms behind the great hall where the family could retreat from the public life that duty demanded. These rooms might be decorated with tapestries that softened stone walls and reduced drafts, might contain furniture more comfortable than the benches of the hall, might offer warmth from fireplaces that served these rooms alone. But privacy was relative. Servants were always present. Family members shared spaces that modern people would find crowded, and the demands of lordship could intrude at any hour. The chapel stood within the castle walls, spiritual centre that was also practical necessity when siege might prevent attending church elsewhere. The castle's priest served both religious and administrative functions, conducting services but also keeping records, writing letters, educating noble children in the literacy that clergy preserved. The chapel's presence reminded all within the walls that power carried obligations, that lordship was not merely privilege, but was responsibility before God. We climbed the spiral stairs that wound through the towers, noting how they turned always clockwise. always giving advantage to defenders who could swing swords with their right hands while attackers were constrained by the central pillar. This detail revealed how completely military purpose shaped every aspect of castle design. Nothing was accidental, nothing merely decorative. Every choice reflecting centuries of accumulated knowledge about how to survive when survival was never guaranteed. The walls were thick beyond what structure required Egypt, the excess providing thermal mass that moderated temperature swings, keeping interiors cool in summer and retaining warmth in winter. The windows were small, limiting heat loss, their narrow openings positioned to admit light while preventing entry. The castle created climate within climate, world within world, space where life could continue regardless of conditions outside the walls. We linger in these stone chambers as evening falls, as torchlight replaces daylight, as the Gorsel settles into patterns of rest that centuries had established. The gates are closed for the night, the watch set on the walls, the household gathered in the hall for evening meal. The castle holds its people like a stone hand, protective but also confining, safety purchased at the price of freedom. The chapter fades with the understanding that these castles were complete worlds, communities where medieval life unfolded through generations, where knights were raised from childhood, knowing every passage and chamber, where the walls themselves seemed to remember every oath sworn within them. The castles that remain standing, ruined or restored, empty or occupied, still carry this memory in their stones, still shelter visitors within walls that were built to shelter against dangers that time has removed, but that the stone has not forgotten. In the workshops of medieval armourers, where forge light flickered against walls blackened by generations of smoke, craftsmen performed a kind of sacred metalwork, shaping steel into shells that would carry men through violence and return them whole, creating second bodies from iron and leather, an ancient understanding of how metal could be made to move. We enter the armourer's world in the early morning, when the forge was being heated for the day's work, watching the transformation of raw metal into protection that would save lives. The earliest medieval armour was simple, leather hardened through boiling, metal rings sewn onto fabric, protection that offered something better than bare flesh, but little more. The warriors who wore this armour knew its limitations, knew that a well-struck blow could still reach vital organs, knew that their survival depended as much on skill and luck as on what they wore. But over centuries, the armourer's craft evolved, driven by the relentless pressure of combat's demands, each generation improving on what came before. The mail shirt, habergeon to those who wore it, represented a breakthrough that dominated medieval protection for centuries. The rings were individually crafted, each one punched from flat metal or drawn from wire, each one closed through riveting or welding, the process requiring patience that modern manufacturing cannot imagine. A single mail shirt might contain 20,000 rings or more, each one linked to its neighbours in patterns that distributed stress, that allowed flexibility while providing coverage, that turned slashing blows while remaining light enough to wear for extended periods. We watched the mail maker at work, his fingers moving with speed that hides the difficulty of his task. The rings are tiny, the holes through which rivets must pass tinier still, the work straining eyes and cramping hands. But the mail maker continues, ring by ring, row by row, building a garment that will take weeks to complete, that will sell for enough to sustain his family for months, that will travel to a warrior who will trust his life to this metal fabric. The mail was worn over padding, the gambeson or akiton, a quilted garment that absorbed impact, that prevented the mail itself from bruising flesh, that provided insulation against both cold and heat. Without this padding, a blow that failed to penetrate the mail could still break bones, could still cause internal damage that was fatal despite the mail's integrity. The layers worked together, each serving distinct purpose, the combination offering protection far greater than either element alone. But mail had limitations that became increasingly clear as weapons evolved to counter it. A thrust could force rings apart, penetrating to flesh beneath. A heavy blow could drive rings into the wound, making extraction difficult and infection likely. The armorers responded with plate, shaped pieces of steel that covered areas most vulnerable to such attacks, that added protection without abandoning the flexibility that mail provided. The development was gradual. First came small plates to protect knees and elbows, joints that both required movement and were particularly vulnerable to injury. Then came larger plates, greaves for the shins, vambraces for the forearms, cuisses for the thighs, each piece shaped to fit the body's contours, each piece articulated where movement was necessary. The great helm appeared, a cylinder of steel that enclosed the head completely, that offered protection far beyond what mail could provide, that created the iconic image of the medieval knight hidden behind faceless metal. By the 14th century, the evolution had produced the full plate armor that we imagine when we think of knights, a complete enclosure of overlapping steel plates, articulated to allow movement, distributed to balance weight, shaped to deflect blows rather than merely absorbing them. This was not merely blacksmithing, but was something approaching sculpture. Each suit shaped to fit one specific body. The curves and angles calculated to guide weapons away from vital points. The thickness varied to concentrate protection where danger was greatest. We watch the fitting. The knight standing patient in the armorer's workshop while adjustments are made. The breastplate must curve correctly to deflect lance strikes downward rather than into the chest. The pauldrons protecting the shoulders must overlap precisely to allow arm movement without creating gaps. The gauntlets must flex with the fingers, while remaining solid enough to protect the hands that would grip sword and shield. Every joint requires attention, every articulation tested through movements that combat might require. The weight was substantial. A full suit of plate armor weighed 40 to 60 pounds, comparable to what a modern soldier carries into combat. But it was distributed across the entire body, supported by the skeleton rather than concentrated on specific points. A well-fitted suit allowed remarkably free movement, the wearer able to run, climb, fight on foot if unhorsed, even turn somersaults in demonstrations that astonished observers who expected the armor to be immobilizing. The mobility was essential. An immobile knight was a dead knight, unable to defend himself, unable to respond to the chaos of battle. The steel was hardened through processes that the armorers understood empirically, if not scientifically. The metal was heated, shaped, quenched in water or oil to create hardness, then tempered through careful reheating to reduce brittleness without sacrificing strength. The result was steel that could resist tremendous impact, that would bend before breaking, that would turn aside weapons that would have penetrated lesser metal. The finest armor, produced by masters whose reputations drew commissions from across Europe, was nearly impervious to weapons of its era. Only the most powerful blows, only the most precisely aimed thrusts, could defeat protection that represented the pinnacle of medieval metallurgy. The polishing came last, the steel brought to mirror brightness through hours of grinding and buffing, the surface reflecting sunlight in ways that served both practical and psychological purpose. The reflection could blind opponents, the flash disorienting in the chaos of melee. The perfect finish demonstrated wealth and status, showed that the knight could afford not merely protection, but beauty. That he served a lord important enough to demand such magnificence. The gleaming knight on his armored horse became symbol of power that transcended individual combat, that proclaimed lordship visible across battlefield distance. We watched the completed armor lifted onto its stand, assembled piece by piece into the form it will wear in battle, the empty suit standing like ghost of the warrior who will fill it. The armor waits, patient, metal anticipating the flesh that will give it purpose, the skill that will guide its movements, the courage that will carry it toward violence from which it will offer protection but not guarantee survival. The chapter closes with the understanding that medieval armor was technology as sophisticated as any the age produced, engineering that allowed human bodies to survive what human bodies were not designed to survive. The suits that survive in museums stand as monuments to the armorer's skill, metal that protected knights through battles 5 centuries past, that bears the marks of combat in dents and scratches that the owners survived to remember. The armor made the knight possible, transformed vulnerable flesh into something that could face the terrors of medieval battle and hope to emerge alive. Created the mounted warrior, whose image still captures our imagination. There existed among the knights of medieval Europe an understanding that was never fully written, a code that lived in the space between law and conscience, that governed behavior not through punishment, but through the weight of honor itself. Chivalry, they called it, though the word contained more than any single translation could capture. We enter this invisible architecture of expectation, this web of duty and restraint that shaped knightly behavior as surely as armor shaped their bodies. The word itself came from the French for horse, cheval marking the knight, first and foremost as mounted warrior, as cavalryman whose effectiveness depended on the partnership between rider and warhorse. But the code that bore this name extended far beyond military technique, encompassing obligations that touched every aspect of knightly life. Chivalry was ethos, was identity, was the framework within which the knight understood himself and was understood by others. The origins of the code were ancient and multiple, threads woven from different sources into something that felt unified but resisted precise definition. From the Germanic warrior traditions came emphasis on personal honor, on loyalty to Lord, on courage that preferred death to disgrace. From the Christian church came obligation to protect the weak, to defend the faith, to temper strength with mercy. From the courtly culture that developed in the 11th and 12th centuries came refinement of manners, respect for women, the elaborate rituals of courtesy that distinguished the noble from the common. We trace these threads through the texts that try to capture what all knights supposedly knew. The handbooks of chivalry that appeared in the later medieval period, works like Ramon Lull's book of the Order of Chivalry, attempted to codify expectations, to create explicit rules for what had been implicit understanding. But these texts revealed as much as they prescribed, their very existence acknowledging that the code was never fixed, that each generation had to discover or rediscover what chivalry meant, that the ideal was always clearer than the practice. The code demanded protection of those who could not protect themselves. This was perhaps its most fundamental requirement, the obligation that distinguished the knight from the mere armed man. The knight who used his strength to oppress the weak was not knight at all, but was monster-wearing knightly trappings, was betrayer of everything the title represented. The church placed specific categories under chivalric protection: the clergy, women, the aged, the young, people whose vulnerability made them dependent on others' restraint, whose safety required that power be exercised with conscience. The code required strength to serve mercy rather than domination. This was the paradox at chivalry's heart. The knight was trained for violence, was equipped for violence, was expected to excel at violence, but was also expected to restrain his violence within boundaries that the code established. He could kill in battle, could wound and capture, could defend his lord's interests through force. But he could not murder the defenseless, could not abuse the captured, could not use his advantages to satisfy mere cruelty. The sword was given so that it could be sheathed as well as drawn, so that the capacity for violence could create space for mercy. We linger with the troubadours, the poet-musicians who sang of knightly ideals in courts across medieval Europe, who created the legends that shaped behavior by showing what behavior could become. Their songs told of knights who embodied the code perfectly, who defended the innocent, who served their ladies with devotion that asked nothing in return, who faced death with courage that preferred honor to survival. These were not accurate descriptions of knightly behavior. Reality was always messier than legend, but they were aspirations, were models that knights measured themselves against, were the idealized selves that actual knights tried to approach, even knowing they would fall short. The code demanded courtesy even in combat, insisted that defeated enemies be treated with honor, required that victory carried obligations rather than merely privileges. A knight who captured another knight in battle was entitled to ransom, to payment for the prisoner's release, but was also obligated to treat the prisoner as guest rather than slave, to house him appropriately to his status, to release him on peril if ransom could not be immediately paid. This courtesy was self-interested as well as principled. The knight, who treated prisoners well, could expect similar treatment if captured himself. But it also reflected genuine belief that honor bound even enemies into relationship, that violence could not entirely sever. The code was enforced not through external punishment, but through internal and social pressure. A knight who violated chivalric expectations might face no legal consequence, no imprisonment or fine, but would face something potentially worse: the loss of reputation that made knighthood meaningful. He would be shamed, would be spoken of in terms that marked him as dishonorable, would be excluded from the society of those who maintained the code. Other knights would refuse to fight him, refuse to capture him, refuse to treat him as peer, because he had proven himself unworthy of treatment that the honorable deserved. We trace the code through its contradictions, through the tensions it created between ideals that could not always be reconciled. The knight owed loyalty to his lord, but also owed obligations to the church. When lord and church conflicted, which loyalty prevailed? The knight was to protect the weak, but was also to pursue his lord's interests. When those interests required actions that harmed the weak, what did honor demand? The knight was to be merciful, but was also to be victorious. When mercy seemed to invite defeat, which value took precedence? These contradictions were real, were felt by those who tried to live within the code. The handbooks offered guidance, but could not resolve tensions that were built into the code's structure. Each knight had to navigate these conflicts himself, had to make choices that might be criticized, regardless of which direction he chose. Had to accept that the code was not rulebook, but was set of competing principles that required judgment to balance. The chapter fades with the understanding that chivalry, though imperfectly followed, created framework within which medieval society could function, gave knights identity beyond their weapons, and left legacy that still shapes our understanding of what honor means. The code transformed potentially dangerous armed men into servants of social order that depended on their restraint, asked violence to serve values that transcended violence, created the possibility that strength could coexist with conscience. Whether knights achieved this ideal is less important than that they recognized it as ideal, that they understood themselves to be bound by obligations that their power made optional, but their honor made necessary. In the traditions of a medieval knighthood, the sword was never merely weapon. It was companion, symbol, and sacred object that carried meaning beyond its function, that received names as horses received names, that was blessed by priests and buried with its owner as if the steel itself possessed soul. We enter the mystery of the name blade, understanding why warriors who faced death regularly would speak to their swords, would trust them as they trusted their own arms, would believe that the steel knew them and would serve them faithfully. The sword was the knight's defining weapon, the mark of his status visible at his side, even when peace made armor unnecessary. Other warriors carried swords, men-at-arms, mercenaries, anyone who could afford the cost. But for the knight, the sword was more than tool, was more than weapon, was symbol of everything his position represented. The sword was authority, was justice, was the power of life and death that noble status conferred. To be knighted was to receive a sword, was to be armed by another knight in ceremony that passed not just steel, but responsibility from one generation to the next. The naming was ancient practice, older than Christianity's arrival in Europe, rooted in beliefs that objects of power accumulated identity through use. A sword that had protected its owner through many battles, that had taken many lives, that had been carried through experiences that would mark anyone who survived them. Such a sword had earned distinction, had proven itself worthy of recognition. The name acknowledged this accumulation, recognized the blade as something more than mere metal, gave it identity separate from the human who wielded it. The great swords of legend, Excalibur, Durandal, Joyeuse, were characters in stories as much as their wielders, their names spoken with reverence that acknowledged their role in shaping history. Charlemagne's Joyeuse was said to change color 30 times a day, to shine so brightly it blinded enemies, to contain within its hilt the lance that pierced Christ's side. Roland's Durandal could cut through marble, through steel, through anything that opposed it. And when Roland was dying at Roncevaux, he tried to destroy the sword to prevent it falling into enemy hands, only to find it indestructible. Arthur's Excalibur came from the Lady of the Lake, was returned to her at Arthur's death, was never merely weapon, but was proof of kingship, symbol of authority that the sword conferred on whoever held it rightfully. These legends exaggerated, of course. Real swords were steel, not magic. But the exaggeration revealed something true about how medieval people understood the relationship between warrior and weapon. The sword was not a tool that anyone could pick up and use equally well. The sword learned its owner, became accustomed to his grip, developed character through use that made it his sword in ways that transcended mere possession. A borrowed sword was not quite trusted, not quite known, not quite the extension of self that one's own sword became. We trace the sword from its forging, watching the smith work metal through processes that transformed raw iron into deadly steel. The forging was not merely mechanical, but was art that required judgment, experience, understanding that could not be fully communicated in words. The smith knew by color when the metal was ready for shaping, knew by sound when the hammer strikes were true, knew by feel when the blade was achieving the balance between hardness and flexibility that a good sword required. The best smiths were renowned across regions, their swords sought by knights who could afford the cost, their names attached to blades that would outlast generations. The sword received blessing when given to a new knight, the priest's words asking God to consecrate the weapon to righteous purpose, to guide the knight's hand in using it, to ensure that the blade served justice rather than mere violence. The blessing was not merely ceremony, but was genuine belief that the spiritual and physical were intertwined, that a sword blessed was different from a sword unblessed, that the priest's words changed something in the steel itself. We watched the years of use that followed, that wore patterns into the grip where the knight's hand naturally fell, that gave the blade the particular marks of one man's fighting style. The parries left traces, tiny marks where enemy blades had been deflected. The strikes left memories in the steel, the blade responding to its owner's habits in ways that another wielder would not find. The sword became personalized, became unique, became so much the knight's own possession that others would recognize it without being told whose blade it was. The sword was never sheathed during the knighting ceremony, but was held bare before the altar, as if the steel itself were making vows alongside the man who would carry it. The blade lay in the candidate's sight throughout the vigil, visible reminder of what he would receive if he endured the night, symbol of the power and responsibility that morning would bring. The sword participated in the ceremony, was touched to the new knight's shoulder in the accolade, was his from that moment until death separated them. The bequest of a sword from father to son was not merely inheritance, but was transfer of trust, of accumulated honor, of responsibility to maintain what the previous wielder had built. The son who received his father's sword received also his father's reputation, his expectations, his unfinished business with enemies and friends alike. The sword carried continuity across generations, physical object that linked living to dead, that made family history tangible in ways that words alone could not achieve. We hold such a sword in imagination, feeling the weight that balances perfectly, the grip worn smooth by hands long still, the blade that bears marks of encounters we will never know. The sword is cold in our hands, steel that holds no warmth, but it is not dead, not merely metal. It carries memory, carries identity, carries something of everyone who held it before us. The name it bears, Grifflet, perhaps, or Marmaduas, or some name lost to history, was given for reasons we cannot recover, but that were real to those who gave it, that recognized something in the blade worth distinguishing. The chapter closes with the understanding that the medieval knight's relationship with his sword revealed something essential about the age. The belief that objects could carry meaning, that steel could hold memory, that the instruments of violence could also be instruments of honor. We have largely lost this understanding, treat our tools as interchangeable, discard them when they wear without thought for what they carried. But the named swords remind us that another relationship is possible, that the things we use can become part of who we are, that giving them names acknowledges connection that goes beyond mere utility. Before the armor, before the sword, before the vigil and the oath, there were the years of preparation, the slow transformation from noble child to squire to knight that occupied childhood and youth entirely, that taught through service what could not be taught through instruction alone. We enter this process of becoming, following the path that began when boys as young as 7 left their families to serve in other households, understanding that knighthood was not merely learned, but was absorbed through years of proximity to those who already embodied it. The departure was difficult. A child of 7 or 8 leaving his mother's barnitshell, travelling to a household where he knew no one, beginning a new life among strangers who would shape his character for good or ill. The practice seems harsh by modern standards, but it served purposes that medieval society considered essential. The child would learn to serve before he was permitted to command, would develop independence from the family whose interests he would one day represent, would form bonds with other noble families that could become alliances in the political marriages and military conflicts that dominated noble life. The page served in the great hall, learning courtly behavior by observing it daily, practicing the manners and speech that would mark him as noble. He carried dishes at table, poured wine for his betters, stood ready to run whatever errands his lord required. The work was menial, but the learning was essential. He watched how nobles spoke to each other, how they treated inferiors, how they navigated the complex relationships of rank and obligation that shaped every interaction. He learned courtesy not from textbooks, but from immersion. From years of observing how the courteous behaved and how the discourteous were regarded. The training of body began alongside the training of manners. The page practiced with wooden swords, building strength and coordination through exercises that would eventually prepare him for real weapons. He learned to ride, beginning on gentle horses and progressing to more spirited mounts as his skill increased, understanding that the knight's effectiveness depended entirely on partnership with the horse that carried him into battle. He learned to care for horses as well as ride them, the feeding and grooming and management of animals that would one day carry him into danger, whose health and willingness could mean the difference between life and death. The years passed, slowly, each day bringing small increments of learning, each season marking growth so gradual it was invisible from within, but obvious to those who watched from without. The page grew taller, grew stronger, grew more confident in the environment that had once been strange. The other pages became friends, became rivals, became companions through experiences that created bonds lasting lifetimes. The household became home, its rhythms familiar, its expectations internalized, its values absorbed so deeply they no longer required conscious thought. By 14, or sometimes earlier, if exceptional promise was recognized, the page might become squire, personal servant to a specific knight whom he would follow everywhere, learning through observation what books could never convey. The squire's role was intimate, was demanding, was preparation for knighthood through the most direct means possible. Watching a knight live his daily life, making mistakes and making amends, receiving instruction in moments between other duties, becoming shadow to the man whose example would shape his own future. The squire cared for armor, knowing every strap and buckle, understanding how the metal was maintained, how it was repaired, how it was worn. The armor was not merely polished, but was studied, was understood as system, was appreciated in its complexity. The squire who could not efficiently arm his knight was squire, who failed his most basic duty, who left his knight vulnerable in moments when efficiency could mean survival. The practice became automatic, the movements familiar, the armor as known to the squire's hands as his own body. He cared for horses with similar intimacy, learning the partnership between rider and mount that cavalry combat required. The destrier The knight's warhorse was valuable beyond measure, was trained for combat as carefully as the knight himself, was asset that required constant attention to maintain at peak readiness. The squire fed and watered, groomed and exercised, monitored health and reported concerns, learned to read the animal's moods and manage its temperament. The horse that trusted its handlers was horse that could be controlled in the chaos of battle. The horse that feared or resented was liability that could kill the knight it carried. He practiced with weapons endlessly, building strength and skill through repetition that made the movements automatic. The wooden swords of childhood gave way to real steel. The exercises increasingly resembling actual combat, the instruction increasingly severe. Bruises were common, injuries not unknown, the training deliberately harsh because the reality it prepared for was harsher still. The squire who could not withstand the training would never withstand the battlefield, would become liability rather than asset, would shame himself and the knight who had accepted responsibility for his preparation. We watched these years unfold slowly, seeing how patience was built into the process, how readiness could not be rushed, how the transformation from boy to knight required time, yet as surely as it required training. The squire learned not just skills but judgment, not just techniques but their application, not just what to do but when to do it. The knight he served demonstrated these qualities daily in decisions large and small, in the management of household and the conduct of conflict, in the 1,000 choices that revealed character more clearly than any proclaimed principles. The squire might accompany his knight to war, might witness combat before being permitted to participate, might taste the fear and excitement of battle while still protected by his non-combatant status. This observation was education that nothing else could provide. Seeing how men behaved under pressure, how formations held or broke, how the chaos of combat was managed or surrendered to. The squire watched his knight, watched others, stored observations that would inform his own behavior when his time came to fight. The years accumulated, 7, perhaps 10, sometimes more, each year bringing the goal closer, each year testing commitment that some found unable to sustain. Not every page became squire, not every squire became knight. Some discovered that the life was not what they had imagined, that the demand exceeded what they could give, that their futures lay elsewhere. They departed without dishonor, recognized as unsuited rather than failed, directed toward other paths that medieval society provided. But for those who persisted, who endured the years and absorbed the training and demonstrated the character that knighthood required, the vigil eventually arrived. The ceremony was performed. The sword was received. The transformation was complete. The boy who had left his mother's care was now knight, was armed and armored and obligated, was prepared by years of service to offer service of his own. The chapter fades with the understanding that medieval knighthood valued preparation over haste, recognized that true capability required years of development, created knights who had earned their status through demonstrated growth rather than inherited title alone. The process was slow by modern standards, patient in ways our accelerated world has a difficulty appreciating. But the slowness served purpose, built foundation, ensured that those who achieved knighthood had been tested through time, had proven themselves capable of bearing the weight that the title carried. On fields marked with pennants and surrounded by pavilions, the tournaments unfolded like war made theatrical. Controlled violence, where knights tested themselves against each other, where skills were sharpened and reputations forged in combat that carried real danger despite its ceremonial trappings. We enter the tournament grounds as dawn breaks on competition day, watching the preparation that transformed ordinary fields into arenas of display and contest. The tournament had emerged in the 11th century, born from the need to maintain combat readiness during periods when actual warfare was less frequent. Knights who did not practice their skills lost them. Weapons unused became unfamiliar. Muscles untested weakened. The tournament provided solution. Regular gatherings where knights could fight each other under conditions approximating battle, could test their prowess against worthy opponents, could maintain the edge that survival required. The earliest tournaments were barely distinguishable from actual combat. The melee was the original form, groups of knights clashing across wide fields, the fighting continuing until one side was clearly defeated, the distinction between practice and war nearly invisible. Participants were injured, sometimes killed, the violence real despite the ceremonial framing. The ransoms demanded from captured knights were genuine financial transactions, stood wealth changing hands based on who had proven stronger. We walk among the pavilions where knights prepare, the tents arranged by heraldic device, each participant's colours marking his territory within the temporary city that has sprung up around the field. The great lords have brought entire households, servants and retainers, armourers and farriers, all the support that maintaining a knight in the field required. The atmosphere mixes celebration and tension, the festivity of the occasion tempered by awareness that the contests ahead will produce real winners and real losers, real injuries and perhaps real deaths. The melee has been restricted over the centuries we observe, its chaos channeled into more controlled forms that reduce risk while maintaining martial purpose. Boundaries limit the field, preventing fights from spreading into surrounding areas. Designated safety zones allow knights to withdraw and regroup. Weapons have been blunted, though not so much that they cannot injure. The dulling reducing lethality without eliminating danger. The rules that govern the fighting have grown more elaborate. The marshals who enforce them more powerful. The penalties for violation more severe. The joust emerged as the tournament evolved. Individual contests that tested the fundamental cavalry skill on which medieval warfare depended. 2 armoured riders, carrying lances of wood designed to shatter rather than penetrate, charged at each other across a field divided by barrier that prevented collision between horses. The goal was straightforward: strike your opponent squarely enough to unhorse him, or failing that, to break your lance against his armour while remaining seated yourself. The scoring was clear, the winner obvious, the individual excellence or failure visible to all observers. We watch as the first pair takes the field, the knights walking their horses to opposite ends of the lists. Turning to face each other across the distance, they will close at speed. The horses are armored as heavily as their riders. The animals trained to charge directly at opposing horses, despite every instinct urging them to avoid collision. The lances are lowered, the signal given, and both riders spur forward into accelerating charge. The impact is tremendous. Horses at full gallop, lances striking shields or breastplates, the force concentrated at the lance tip before the wood shatters. One rider rocks back in his saddle but remains mounted. The other is lifted clear of his horse, armour and all, landing heavily in the churned earth of the lists. The crowd roars. The winner circles back to acknowledge acclaim. The fallen knight is helped to his feet by squires who check for injury before leading him from the field. The dangers were real, the injuries common. A lance that did not break could penetrate armour, could wound or kill. The fall from a galloping horse could break bones, could cause internal damage that would prove fatal days later. The tournament field was not safe, could never be made safe while retaining the martial purpose that justified its existence. The knights who competed accepted these risks, understood that the skills they were maintaining were skills that required real danger to develop, that training that carried no risk would produce knights unprepared for battles where risk was absolute. The ransoms paid by defeated knights could make careers for successful competitors. A knight of modest means could become wealthy through tournament success, could accumulate enough through ransoms and prizes to support a household, to fund the equipment and training that further success required. The tournament created economy of martial excellence, rewarded those who excelled with resources that perpetuated their excellence, created incentive for continuous improvement that served both individual ambition and social need. We observed the social dimensions that surrounded the fighting. The ladies watching from elevated stands, the favours given to knights who would carry them into the lists, the courtly rituals that made the tournament as much social occasion as military exercise. The tournaments provided opportunities for young people to meet potential spouses, for alliances to be negotiated, for disputes to be resolved through combat that was violent but contained. The gathering of nobility from across the region created political possibilities that the scattered daily life of medieval lordship rarely provided. The heralds moved through the crowds, their expertise in identifying knights by their devices essential in the chaos of melee and the distance of joust. They recorded results, announced matches, ensured that the elaborate rules governing competition were followed and violations penalized. Their records became official histories, their judgments accepted as authoritative, their role bridging the gap between the fighting and the audience that witnessed it. The tournament was entertainment, undeniably, spectacle that drew crowds and generated excitement that peaceful daily life could not match. But it was also serious, was training for a warrior class that served essential functions, was maintenance of skills that kingdoms depended on. The knight who excelled in tournament was knight likely to excel in battle, was asset to any lord who could secure his service. was proven capable in ways that no other testing could demonstrate. The chapter closes as the day's final matches conclude, as the torches are lit around the pavilions, as the feasting begins that will continue through the night. The wounded are being tended, the victors celebrated, the defeated consoling themselves with the thought of next time. The tournament has served its purpose. Skills have been tested, reputations adjusted, the martial culture that defined the age renewed through ritual that kept its edges sharp. When the knights of Europe rode eastward toward Jerusalem, they carried more than weapons. They carried belief that transformed military campaign into sacred pilgrimage, that made the recovery of holy sites a duty outweighing comfort, safety, or life itself. We enter the mindset of the crusading knight, understanding how religious conviction could motivate men to travel thousands of miles toward uncertain fate. How the cross, sewn onto their garments, marked them as soldiers of faith, whose cause transcended earthly kingdoms. The call had come in 1095, Pope Urban II preaching at Clermont, the necessity of aiding Eastern Christians and recovering the places where Christ had walked, died, and risen. The response exceeded anything the Pope had anticipated. Not just the lords he had addressed, but people of all stations taking the cross, sewing it onto their clothing, selling their possessions, preparing for a journey from which many would never return. The movement that began at Clermont would continue in various forms for 2 centuries, would shape European politics and religion and culture in ways still visible today. The motivation was religious, genuinely and profoundly. We struggle in our secular age to comprehend how completely medieval people believed in the spiritual realities that the Church proclaimed, how immediate and urgent salvation seemed, how terrifying damnation appeared to those who took seriously the teachings they had received. The crusade offered unprecedented spiritual opportunity, remission of sins, guarantee of salvation, the chance to perform pilgrimage while fighting for God rather than merely traveling to holy sites. For knights who had spent their lives in violence that troubled their consciences, the crusade offered redemption, offered chance to turn the martial skills they possessed toward purpose that was sacred rather than merely political. We follow them as they departed, leaving homes and families for journeys whose duration could not be predicted, whose hardships could only be imagined. The routes across Europe were difficult enough. Mountain passes, river crossings, territories whose lords were not always friendly to armed bands passing through. But these difficulties were merely prelude to the true challenges that lay beyond. The vast distances of the Byzantine Empire, the hostile territories where Muslim forces controlled access to the holy sites that were the journey's goal. The journey itself was ordeal, claiming lives through disease and hardship long before combat was joined. Armies that set out thousands strong arrived at their destinations diminished, weakened by months or years of travel, reduced to fractions of their original numbers by illness that spread through close-packed camps, by accidents that befell travelers in unfamiliar terrain, by shortages of food and water that turned allies into competitors for survival. Those who survived the journey arrived exhausted, their resources depleted, their numbers insufficient for the military campaigns that awaited them. They found landscapes utterly foreign to European experience, heat that made armor into torture chamber, terrain that favored defenders who knew its secrets, enemies whose tactics differed fundamentally from those the Crusaders had trained to counter. The initial success of the First Crusade, the capture of Jerusalem in 1099, owed much to the divisions among Muslim powers, to timing that caught defenders unprepared, to fortune that favored the invaders despite their exhaustion and reduced numbers. But the states established by that success proved difficult to maintain, requiring continuous reinforcement from Europe, vulnerable to counterattack once Muslim forces organized effective resistance. We linger with the military orders that emerged to defend what had been gained. The Templars, the Hospitallers, the Teutonic Knights. Organizations that combined monastic discipline with martial purpose, creating warriors who had taken vows, who lived in community, who served causes beyond personal advancement. These orders represented something new, synthesis of religious and military life that earlier Christianity had generally kept separate. Their members were monks who fought, warriors who prayed, men bound by vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, who nevertheless rode to battle in armor as fine as any secular knight possessed. The Templars became bankers as well as soldiers, their network of commanderies across Europe, handling the financial transactions that crusading required, transferring wealth safely across distances where ordinary merchants could not travel. The Hospitallers maintained facilities for pilgrims, hospitals that cared for the sick and exhausted, charitable services that justified their military role. The orders accumulated wealth and power that eventually threatened the very kingdoms they were supposed to serve, their independence and resources making them formidable forces in European politics as well as crusading warfare. The later Crusades achieved less than the first, recaptured Jerusalem when it was lost only to lose it again, watched as the states established in the East contracted and eventually disappeared entirely. The military logic that had favored the Crusaders initially, Muslim disunity, European enthusiasm, the element of surprise, reversed over time. The defenders learned Crusader tactics, developed counters, exploited the invaders' dependence on reinforcement from distant Europe. The Fourth Crusade never reached the Holy Land at all, diverted instead to attack Constantinople. Christian attacking Christian in debacle that weakened both at the expense of neither's enemies. We trace the complex legacy of these expeditions, the violence that cannot be excused, the faith that cannot be dismissed, the cultural exchanges that occurred despite hostility. The Crusaders encountered civilizations more sophisticated than their own in many respects, brought back knowledge and technologies that would transform Europe. They also brought back hatreds, memories of atrocity committed and suffered, divisions between Christianity and Islam that deepened rather than healed. The dream of recovering holy places mingled forever with the reality of holy war, sacred purpose inseparable from sacred violence. The chapter fades with the understanding that the Crusades represented medieval knighthood at its most complex and contradictory. The same code that demanded protection of the weak permitted slaughter of infidels. The same faith that inspired heroism justified atrocity. The knights who took the cross were not monsters, but were men of their age, shaped by beliefs that we cannot share but cannot responsibly dismiss. Participants in history whose judgment belongs to God, if to anyone. They rode toward Jerusalem carrying hopes and fears, sins and dreams, leaving behind them trails that history still follows, questions that history still asks. Across shields and banners and the fabric covering horses, the heraldic devices proclaimed identity in a world where armor made faces invisible. Lions and eagles and crosses and geometric patterns arranged according to rules as strict as any grammar, creating visual language that could be read across battlefield distance. We enter the world of heraldry, understanding how these symbols emerged from practical necessity, how the need to identify friend from foe during combat created elaborate system that became central to noble identity. The need was practical before it was symbolic. When knights began enclosing their faces in great helms in the 12th century, when the familiar features that would have identified them disappeared behind walls of steel, some system became necessary for recognition at distance. The solution emerged gradually, painting shields with distinctive patterns, decorating surcoats with matching designs, creating visual identity that could be recognized when personal features could not. The system that developed was sophisticated, was governed by rules that specialists spent lifetimes mastering. The colors were limited and precisely defined. Gules for red, azure for blue or for gold, argent for silver, sable for black, vert for green, purple for purple. These colors were not merely decorative choices, but were technical terms in a specialized language, each with precise meaning, each subject to rules governing combination and placement. Metal could not be placed on metal. Color could not be placed on color, the contrast ensuring visibility at distance. The charges placed upon these colored fields told stories, commemorated victories, claimed virtues, asserted connections to legendary ancestors. The lion represented courage, nobility, royalty, was favored by kings whose authority the beast's majesty reinforced. The eagle represented power, empire, divine favor, was borne by those who claimed succession to Rome or protection from heaven. The cross announced Christian faith, crusading heritage, devotion to church that shaped identity as surely as any secular loyalty. Geometric patterns, chevrons and bends and pales might indicate family relationships, might commemorate specific events, might simply distinguish one branch of a family from another whose right to the same colors could not be denied. We watch the heralds at work, those specialists whose expertise in identifying devices made them essential figures in tournament and battle. The herald knew every major device in the region, could identify a knight from across the field by the pattern on his shield, could announce participants by their proper titles, could ensure that the courtesies due to rank were properly observed. The herald's memory was encyclopedia of noble identity, his knowledge of devices translated into knowledge of family relationships, alliances, feuds, and claims that the symbols represented. The role expanded over time, the heralds becoming record keepers, their registers documenting who was entitled to bear which arms, resolving disputes when different parties claimed the same device, granting new arms to those whose achievement warranted recognition. The College of Arms in England, the similar institutions in France and the Empire, gave official structure to what had begun as practical necessity, creating bureaucracy of identity that regulated the symbols through which nobility was known. The shield was personal statement, but it was also legal document. The arms a man bore announced his identity more certainly than any written name in an age when many could not read, but all could recognize distinctive patterns. The right to bear certain arms could determine inheritance, could validate claims to lands and titles, could establish precedents in disputes where rank determined outcome. The arms were not decoration, but were proof, were evidence as certain as any document. More certain in a world where documents could be forged, but arms were witnessed and remembered by those who saw them displayed. We trace how the system grew more elaborate, just the need for distinction increased. When the simple devices had all been claimed, combinations became necessary. The shield divided into quarters, each quarter bearing different arms, the quarters representing different lineages that had merged through marriage. A shield might grow ever more complex through generations, accumulating the arms of each family that had contributed to the present bearer's ancestry, becoming visual genealogy that the informed could read as others read words. The women bore arms differently, their shields displayed on lozenges rather than traditional shield shapes, their devices combining their birth family's arms with their husbands, creating new combinations that marked the alliances that marriage had created. The children bore arms with marks of cadence, small symbols that identified their position in the family. Eldest sons bearing labels, second sons crescents, third sons stars. The variations allowing identification of specific individuals within families that might have many members entitled to bear the same basic arms. We linger with the common charges, the symbols that appeared repeatedly because their meanings were widely understood and valued. The fleur-de-lis announced French connection was associated with royalty, whose favour it might indicate. The rose was English, was particularly associated with the houses whose struggle for the throne became the wars of the roses. The trefoil invoked the Trinity, was religious symbol that announced piety, while adding distinctive element to shields that might otherwise be too similar to distinguish. The language of heraldry developed its own vocabulary, its own grammar, its own conventions that the uninitiated found impenetrable, but the knowledgeable could read as easily as any text. To blazon arms was to describe them in the proper technical language, each term precise, the description alone sufficient to recreate the visual image. A knight might be described as bearing azure, a lion rampant or blue field, golden lions standing on the hind legs. And any herald hearing this description would know exactly what the shield looked like, could identify it on sight, could record it in registers that would preserve the identification for generations. The arms became sacred in their way, were treated with reverence that lesser possessions could not claim. To insult another's arms was to insult his family, his ancestors, everything his identity encompassed. To bear arms one was not entitled to was fraud, was theft of identity that courts could punish. The arms connected the living to the dead, the present to the past, the individual to the lineage that gave him meaning. The chapter closes with the understanding that heraldry was not decoration, but was communication, was identity made visible, was the medieval answer to the fundamental question that armor raised: how to know who stood behind the steel when faces could not be seen. The system survives today, diminished in significance but not entirely abandoned. The arms that once meant everything, now mostly ceremonial. But the shields in museums, the banners in cathedrals, the devices carved on tombs, these remind us that once these symbols mattered absolutely. Were the faces that noble families showed to the world, were as individual as fingerprints and as permanent as the stone into which they were carved. Within the stone walls where knights and their households dwelt, life unfolded according to rhythms as regular as monastery bells. The daily pattern of duties and meals and watches that kept the castle functioning, that maintained readiness for threats that might never come, but could never be dismissed. We enter this rhythm, following the castle through a single day, from the darkness before dawn through the darkness after night fell. The watch changed in the coldest hours. The sentries who had stood through darkness surrendering their posts to those who would stand through morning. The transition marked by challenges and passwords that would expose any enemy who had somehow penetrated the outer defenses. The walls were never unguarded, the gates never unwatched, the vigilance continuous, because the dangers were continuous, because the castle's safety depended absolutely on maintaining awareness that complacency would destroy. The guards who came off watch retreated to the guard quarters, to beds still warm from those who had just risen, to sleep that would last until evening when the cycle resumed. Their day was night, their night was day, the rhythm of watch duty inverting normal patterns, creating community within the castle whose schedule separated them from the household's main activities. The household stirred gradually as light began to strengthen, servants rising before lords, fires being revived from banked coals, the day's work beginning while nobles still slept. The kitchen was already active, bread dough that had risen overnight being shaped and baked. The main meal of the day requiring preparation that would continue for hours. The smell of baking bread spread through the castle, waking appetites that the morning prayers would temporarily suspend. The lord and lady rose for morning mass, the castle's chapel receiving them while the household continued its preparations. The priest conducting services that began each day with prayer, that reminded all within the walls that their safety depended not on stone alone, but on the God who protected the faithful. The Mass was brief on ordinary days, longer on Sundays and holy days, but was never omitted, was the foundation on which the day's activities were built. The knights emerged to morning practice as the sun cleared the walls, their training continuing regardless of whether war was imminent or peace seemed secure. The clash of practice weapons echoed across courtyards that had heard such sounds for generations. The strikes and parries maintaining skills that were never finished learning. Even veteran knights practiced daily, understanding that the edge that separated survival from death required constant honing. The squires attended the knights, observed and assisted, learned through participation what instruction alone could never convey. Between bouts, they cared for equipment, checked armor straps, oiled leather, sharpened edges, performed the maintenance that readiness required. The equipment was never neglected, was inspected regularly, was kept at the state of readiness that instant deployment might require. The morning meal was informal, bread and ale consumed while standing or sitting briefly, the household not yet gathering for the ceremonial dining that would mark the main meal. People ate as their duties permitted, some having already worked for hours, others just beginning the tasks that the day required. The great hall was nearly empty during morning hours, its importance reserved for the gatherings that would fill it later. The business of the manor occupied the morning. Disputes to arbitrate, accounts to review, correspondence to dictate to scribes who preserved Lord's words in permanent form. The Lord sat in judgment when judgment was required, heard complaints from tenants and villagers, rendered decisions that his position made binding. The lady supervised household operations, managed servants whose work she directed, ensured that the castle functioned as smoothly as her efforts could achieve. We trace how the great hall transformed through the day, its purpose shifting as hours passed. The morning's relative emptiness gave way to gathering at midday, when the main meal brought the household together in display of community that was simultaneously practical and symbolic. The trestle tables were assembled, the cloths laid, the benches arranged in patterns that reflected the hierarchy everyone understood. The Lord's table stood on a raised platform at one end, visible to all, the physical representation of authority that shaped every aspect of castle life. The Lord and Lady sat with their highest-ranking guests and household officers, their food superior in quality to what the lower tables received. Their service provided by those whose proximity to power was itself a privilege. The knights sat at their own table, their status marking them as above servants but below the Lord's intimate circle. The meal was elaborate by ordinary standards, multiple courses served in sequence, the castle's resources displayed through the variety and quantity of food presented. The meat was carved ceremonially, the portions distributed according to status, the servings themselves communicating hierarchy as clearly as the seating did. The bread was fresh, the ale plentiful, the vegetables prepared in ways that made the most of what the season provided. Entertainment accompanied the meal on festive occasions. Musicians playing, storytellers recounting tales that everyone knew but everyone wanted to hear again. Sometimes acrobats or jugglers whose skills amazed observers who saw such performances rarely. The meal was social as well as nutritional, was occasion for the household to cohere as community, was time set aside from work for pleasure that was as necessary as labor. The afternoon brought return to duties, the meal's relaxation ending as responsibilities resumed. The household scattered to their various occupations. the steward managing accounts, the marshal overseeing stables, the chaplain teaching children their letters, the servants continuing the endless work of maintaining the castle. The lord might ride out to inspect lands, to hunt if game was available and time permitted, to visit the villages that owed him service and to which he owed protection. Evening brought the household together again. The second meal less elaborate than the first, but still ceremonial. The gathering maintaining the community that the day's scattered work had temporarily dissolved. The entertainment that might accompany this meal was often conversation, the recounting of the day's events, the sharing of news that visitors had brought, the speculation about affairs beyond the castle walls that would eventually affect those within. The chapter fades as night settles over the castle, as the gates are secured, as the watch is set, as the household prepares for rest that will be interrupted by the cycle beginning again. The castle holds its people through darkness as through day, protects them while they sleep, maintains its vigilance while they dream. The stones that sheltered them were not merely walls, but were the fabric of their lives, were the world within which everything else happened, were home as completely as any place could be home in an age when home meant safety, and safety meant stone. In the centuries when gunpowder changed what warfare meant, when walls that had stood against all assault crumbled before cannons, when the cavalry charge that had dominated battlefields for generations became suicide against massed firearms, the age of the night began its long twilight. Not sudden ending, but gradual transformation. The old ways persisting in ceremony long after they had ceased to matter in combat. We enter this fading, understanding how the knights themselves struggled to comprehend changes that rendered their skills irrelevant. The gunpowder weapons appeared gradually, their early forms too unreliable, too slow, too dangerous to their users to threaten the mounted knight's battlefield dominance immediately. But the weapons improved, became more reliable, became faster to load and aim, became capable of penetrating armor that no sword could defeat. The knight who charged a line of arquebusiers was knight riding toward death, his armor useless against projectiles that struck before he could close to sword range, his horse a target even larger than himself. The response was denial as much as adaptation. Armor grew heavier in futile attempts to resist bullets. This increased weight slowing horses, exhausting riders, defeating the mobility that had made cavalry effective. The heaviest armor could resist firearms at distance, but no armor could resist firearms at the ranges where combat actually occurred, where arquebuses and later muskets were accurate enough to aim rather than merely pointed in the general direction of the enemy. The tactics that had worked for centuries suddenly produced only casualties. The cavalry charge, the thundering advance of armored horses carrying armored men, had swept infantry from fields for 500 years. But infantry that stood behind walls of pike, that fired volleys of shot into approaching horsemen, that did not break and run but held their ground behind weapons that multiplied each man's fighting power. Such infantry could not be defeated by traditional means, could slaughter cavalry that persisted in traditional tactics. we trace the institutional survival of knighthood, even as its martial function disappeared. The title persisted, the ceremonies continued, the ideals were proclaimed and allegedly honored. But the knights who rode to battle in the 16th century and beyond were increasingly anachronisms, were playing roles that no longer matched military reality, were maintaining traditions that sentiment preserved, but that practical necessity no longer demanded. The tournaments continued, but their relationship to actual warfare grew increasingly abstract. The skills displayed in tournament, the lance work, the sword handling, the horsemanship, became less and less applicable to the battles that decided kingdoms. Tournament became sport rather than training, became display of a tradition being preserved rather than maintained for practical purpose. The crowd still gathered, the champions still competed, but everyone understood that what they witnessed was performance, was memory enacted rather than preparation undertaken. The codes persisted, the ideals of chivalry proclaimed in an age when their application had become problematic at best. The new soldiers, mercenaries who owed loyalty only to pay, infantry who had no stake in noble honor, gunners who killed from distance without ever facing their victims in personal combat, fought without regard for rules that had once governed conflict between gentlemen. The knight who showed mercy might face opponent who knew no mercy. The knight who treated prisoners honorably might be captured by those who treated prisoners as resources to be exploited, rather than as guests to be hosted. We watched the castles become obsolete, their walls indefensible against artillery that could reduce to rubble in hours what had once resisted siege for months. The thick walls that had protected generations became liabilities, targets that gunners could not miss, mass that absorbed cannonballs but eventually crumbled before the sustained bombardment that gunpowder permitted. New fortifications arose, lower, star-shaped, designed to deflect, rather than simply absorb artillery fire. But these were not castles in the traditional sense, were military installations, rather than homes, were garrisoned by troops rather than inhabited by families. The manor houses that replaced castles made no pretense of fortification, their walls thin, their windows large, their designs announcing that protection now came from other sources, from royal armies that maintained order, from laws that punished those who threatened the peace, from the gradual emergence of states strong enough to monopolize violence within their territories. The knight, who had once needed stone walls to protect his family, now needed only the king's justice, the state's intervention, the bureaucratic protection that replaced personal military power. The orders that had once defended Christendom became honorary societies, their military function obsolete, their continued existence justified by charity and tradition, rather than by the crusading purpose that had called them into being. The Templars had already fallen, destroyed by a king who coveted their wealth, their end demonstrating that even institutions that had seemed permanent could be swept away when their usefulness expired. The Hospitallers adapted, became administrators of the Mediterranean islands, retained nominal military function, while their actual purpose transformed into something barely recognizable as the mission that had created them. The title knight transformed from description of military function to marker of social status. Kings knighted men who would never wear armor, would never carry swords in battle, would serve through administration rather than combat. The knighthood became honor rather than function, recognition of achievement rather than obligation to martial service, reward that government could bestow at relatively low cost. The chapter closes with the understanding that the medieval knight did not disappear but transformed, that the values of the chivalric code persisted in new forms, that the memory of armored warriors riding under bright banners continued to shape imagination long after the last knight had hung up his sword. The transformation was loss, something genuine, something valuable, something that cannot be recovered, but was also continuity, adaptation, the survival in altered form of ideals that had shaped an entire civilization. In the castles that remain standing, in the armor preserved in museums, in the manuscripts where illuminated knights ride forever across golden backgrounds, the medieval world persists, not as living practice, but as memory that still speaks to something within us, that still offers images of honor and duty and courage that we have not entirely outgrown. We enter this persistence, walking through ruins where walls still stand though roofs fell centuries ago, touching stone that armored hands once touched, feeling how the past is never entirely pulled when its monuments endure. The castles draw us still, ruins that have become destinations, tourist attractions where crowds gather to walk passages that knights once walked, to stand in halls where lords once feasted, to climb towers from which sentries once watched for threats that no longer come. The stones are cold now, exposed to weather that the roofs once excluded, growing plants in cracks that medieval mortar once prevented. But the shapes remain, the layouts visible, the intentions of the builders who died centuries ago still legible in the structures they raised. We walk these passages in imagination, populating the emptiness with the lives that once filled it, hearing in the silence the sounds that once echoed, servants calling, children playing, knights practicing in courtyards now open to sky. The castle was home to these people in ways that modern homes rarely achieve, was complete world within walls, was security and community and identity, all woven together in stone that still stands, though everyone who lived within it has been dust for generations. The armor in museum cases seems to wait for its wearers, shaped still to bodies that have been dust for 500 years, glished metal reflecting visitors who will never know what it felt like to carry that weight into battle. The armor is beautiful. Engineering and art combined is testimony to the skill of craftsmen whose names are mostly forgotten, but whose work survives. We look at it and try to imagine the man who wore it, his height and weight determinable from the armor's dimensions, his experiences unknowable, his courage or fear in battle lost with his dying breath. The manuscripts show knights as their age wished to remember them, perfect, radiant, serving ladies whose beauty justified any sacrifice. Images that were idealization then and remain idealization now. The illuminated pages glow with gold leaf, with colors that have remained vivid despite centuries of passing, with figures that seem more than human because they were meant to be more than human, were examples to be aspired to rather than records of actual behavior. We look at these images knowing they are not accurate, knowing they were never meant to be accurate, knowing that their purpose was to inspire rather than to document. The stories survive as well, the legends that emerged from medieval reality, but transcended it, that told of knights whose courage exceeded human capacity, whose honor never faltered, whose loyalty never wavered. Arthur and his Round Table, Lancelot and Guinevere, Roland at Roncesvalles, the Cid Campeador, these figures became larger than any historical original could have been, became symbols that carried meanings that exceeded any individual's life. We read these stories still, find them still compelling, recognize into them something that speaks across the centuries that separate us from the age that created them. We linger with these remnants, understanding that the distance between us and the medieval knight is simultaneously vast and small. We no longer fight with swords, no longer build in stone for protection, no longer organize our societies around mounted warriors whose personal courage determined the outcomes of conflicts. The world has changed so completely that the knight's world is nearly incomprehensible to those who try to imagine living in it. But we still struggle with questions about honor and courage and duty that the knights confronted. Still seek codes by which violence might be constrained and power made to serve justice. Still wonder what it means to serve something greater than ourselves. The knight's answers are not our answers. His world was too different, his assumptions too foreign, his God too literal. But the questions he faced remain our questions. The struggles he knew remain recognizable as struggles we too know. The chapter fades into the stillness of castle chambers, where sunlight enters through windows that once held no glass, where our footsteps echo against stone that remembers other footsteps, where the memory of the medieval knight waits in patient permanence as for those who still wish to learn. The silence is not empty, but is full of the lives that were lived here, full of the courage that was found here, full of the fear and hope and faith and doubt that human beings experienced within walls that remain though the humans have gone. We carry something with us as we leave, something we cannot quite name, something that the castle has given without our asking. Perhaps it is awareness that the present is not the only way things can be, that other people lived other lives with other assumptions and still found meaning, still loved their children, still hoped for better tomorrows, still faced death with whatever courage they could muster. Perhaps it is recognition that the values the knights claimed, protection of the weak, service to higher purpose, courage when courage costs, are values that still call to us, that still seem worth pursuing even when we know how imperfectly those who proclaimed them managed to practice them. The evening deepens. The stones grow cold in imagining. The medieval world recedes into the past where it belongs, into the memory that is all we can have of what is gone. But the memory remains, refuses to fade entirely, continues to offer its images and its questions to those who will receive them. The silence holds. The stone remembers. And somewhere in the space between past and present, the medieval knight rides still, carrying his sword and his oath and his hope that honor might mean something, that courage might matter, that service might justify the burden of power. Rides still through the history that will not quite let him rest, through the memory that will not quite let him be forgotten, through the imagination that still needs what he represents, even when it knows he never quite achieved it. The silence holds. The stone remembers forever.